The morning began with quiet anticipation, yet within seconds the world shattered into chaos. Alarms screamed across the corporate tower, their red lights pulsing like veins of panic that spread through the glass walls. Alexander Pierce stood frozen at the head of the boardroom, his jaw tightening as screens erupted with accusations and numbers that plunged like stones. The narrator told of whispers igniting like wildfire as trust evaporated in the face of calamity. Alexander's voice carried through the storm when he declared that it was sabotage, not coincidence. Laura Bennett leaned closer, her words low and sharp as she warned that whoever struck had done so from within. Around them, board members shifted uneasily, eyes flickering between loyalty and betrayal, the atmosphere heavy with fear. In a single moment, control splintered, trust fractured, and the empire Alexander built trembled on the edge of ruin. The alarms faded into silence, yet dread filled the boardroom like smoke. Alexander Pierce broke the stillness when he declared that the leak had been planned to crush them at the perfect moment. Laura Bennett's voice trembled with urgency as she insisted that the betrayal came from within. Suspicion spread like fire, each glance between the board members sharp enough to wound. Daniel Harper sat rigid, avoiding every pair of eyes while his hands tightened around a sheaf of papers. The narrator described the suffocating air, heavy as the storm raging outside, pressing on everyone with unseen weight. Isolation crept over Alexander for the first time, the reflection of cracks on the glass walls, mocking his authority. Every word risked reshaping the fragile balance of loyalty. The narrator told how a leader faced not only rivals, but shadows whispering treachery in his midst. The news leapt from the boardroom into the veins of the financial world. On trading floors across the globe, phones screamed, monitors bled red, and panic churned through crowded offices. The narrator, said Alexander Pierce, watched from the glass deck above as his empire staggered under invisible blows. He admitted aloud that hesitation would grant their enemies the advantage. Laura Bennett urged restraint, yet her words carried doubt heavier than hope. Messages streamed in like arrows, reporting cancelled deals, frozen accounts, and allies retreating into silence. The narrator explained how the building itself seemed alive, buzzing with catastrophe. For Alexander's survival now demanded instinct sharper than strategy. The corporate jungle had declared war, and its first strike had already cut deep. Whispers of betrayal crawled through the boardroom like snakes in the grass. The narrator observed Robert Kane's faint smirk as though victory already sat in his pocket. Alexander Pierce's words cut through the air as he accused someone of profiting while he bled. Silence followed, the kind sharpened into weapons. Laura Bennett caught Kane's sly glance and murmured that trust was crumbling faster than the collapsing numbers. Fear grew teeth, morphing into anger that threatened to fracture the board forever. The narrator explained how the room throbbed with electricity, every look an unspoken threat. Ambition was gone, replaced by the raw battle for survival. The corporate jungle devoured the weak and tested every alliance, leaving only the strongest or most ruthless standing. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within, lightning splitting the skyline as thunder rolled like a warning. The narrator described Alexander Pierce standing tall in the glow of the tempest, his voice low but unyielding as he vowed that if war was demanded, he would deliver it. Laura Bennett's warning reached him like a whisper in the gale, as she reminded him the enemy moved unseen among them. His jaw clenched harder as his resolve hardened into steel. Power no longer wore the shape of a crown, but of a blade pressed against his throat. The narrator revealed how the empire stood fragile, trembling with every secret exposed, while Alexander transformed from a figurehead into a survivor prepared for the cruel trial ahead. The thunder answered his vow with a roar that sealed the first act in defiance and fire. The narrator described how the boardroom's storm carried into the day, as whispers of treachery spread. Alexander Pierce paced the hall outside, his polished shoes striking the marble like drumbeats of war. His voice cut through silence when he swore that the attack had been orchestrated by a hand too close to ignore. Laura Bennett urged him to steady his judgment, but doubt flickered in her eyes. Daniel Harper lingered in the shadows, his papers clutched tightly, while suspicion gnawed at every corner of the empire. The narrator revealed how the building seemed to bend beneath weight, its steel and glass trembling with secrets yet to be revealed. Trust had fractured, and Alexander stood at the threshold of a hunt. The jungle within his own walls had awakened, and the air pulsed with the scent of betrayal. The narrator revealed how Alexander convened his closest allies in a dim conference chamber. Screens glowed faint blue against the walls, charts of losses bleeding across them like open wounds. Laura Bennett warned that timing was too precise to be accident. Alexander spoke of wolves circling the empire and vowed to find their teeth. Robert Kane leaned back, his smirk growing sharper, while Daniel Harper avoided every glance. The narrator described how tension crackled between allies like a wire pulled taut. No comfort remained, only suspicion and dread. Each voice carried the weight of survival, and every glance hinted at betrayal. The chamber became a crucible where fear and anger melted into ruthless determination. Alexander's empire had no choice but to fight from the shadows or be consumed by them. The narrator described how the enemy's shadows stretched into the trading floors where chaos had become routine. Alexander stood among the frenzy, his presence drawing silence as he announced that every collapse pointed to an orchestrated strike. Laura Bennett followed, her voice steady but lined with fear, urging the team to seal leaks before more damage spread. Traders exchanged frantic looks, and whispers of spies carried across the room. The narrator explained how suspicion transformed the office into a hunting ground where trust evaporated. Phones rang endlessly, each call a dagger of doubt. Alexander felt the jungle close in, every corner alive with danger. What once had been his empire now looked like hostile terrain. In his eyes, survival demanded not just leadership, but the unmasking of traitors hidden in plain sight. The narrator revealed how night fell, yet the storm outside mirrored the turbulence inside. Alexander gathered in his private office, its walls lined with shelves of books and polished steel. He stared into the city lights, confessing that betrayal cut deeper than market loss. Laura urged caution, reminding him that rash choices would invite disaster. Robert Kane entered with measured steps, his smile faint, suggesting rivals already celebrated their collapse. Alexander's eyes burned with fury as he warned that loyalty would be tested before dawn. The narrator described how silence swallowed the office, broken only by thunder outside. Every word carried double weight, every smile a hidden blade. In that moment, Alexander no longer searched for answers. He prepared for war within his own empire. The narrator described how the night ended with Alexander addressing the inner circle for the last time that day. His voice carried steel as he swore the empire would not fall, even as betrayal corroded its heart. Laura Bennett's gaze followed him, her silence holding both fear and faith. Robert Kane reclined with a smirk that dared defiance, his words dripping with mockery. Daniel Harper fumbled with notes, sweat tracing his brow. The narrator told of lightning cracking outside, echoing Alexander's vow to turn weakness into fury. The walls of glass reflected every fracture, turning the chamber into a hall of ghosts. Survival demanded blood, truth, and sacrifice, and Alexander knew the jungle was only beginning to bare its fangs. The air closed on his final words like iron gates around a battlefield. The narrator revealed how Alexander Pierce returned to the boardroom at dawn, the storm's fury still echoing in his veins. He declared that the empire faced a rival more cunning than chance, a predator masked as a partner. Laura Bennett urged caution, her voice wrapped in reason but shadowed by fear. Robert Kane sat with arms crossed, his smile faint and unreadable. The younger Daniel Harper lowered his gaze, his silence loud with guilt. The narrator described how the walls of glass became a mirror, reflecting suspicion across every face. Alexander's words hardened as he vowed to expose the enemy before the week was done. The corporate jungle had revealed its teeth, and the first spark of open rivalry threatened to ignite into full war. The narrator explained how Alexander took the battle outside the boardroom, confronting markets and rivals with fierce resolve. He stood before investors, his voice a blade slicing through doubt, promising survival despite sabotage. Laura Bennett watched from the side, her face set in steel, though fear clung to her eyes. Robert Kane whispered among allies, feeding the fire of distrust. The narrator described the atmosphere as electric, each word Alexander spoke pushing back the tide of collapse while unseen hands tried to drag him under. Investors shifted uneasily, their loyalty as fragile as glass under pressure. Alexander's speech ended on a vow that he would not surrender his throne to shadows. The jungle echoed with the growl of defiance, yet its dangers deepened with every echo. The narrator told how whispers of betrayal carried to Alexander's private war room. Screens lined the walls, each one a battlefield of numbers, bleeding red. He demanded reports, each line a clue to the saboteur. Laura Bennett urged him to slow down, reminding him that haste fed mistakes. Robert Kane entered late, his smirk growing sharper with every flicker of chaos. Daniel Harper shuffled papers, his trembling hands betraying nerves he could not hide. The narrator described how suspicion grew into certainty, each glance sharper, each silence louder. Alexander's voice thundered that no enemy would stand unpunished, his words a vow etched in stone. The war room became a stage where loyalty and deceit clashed, and shadows drew closer with every heartbeat. The narrator revealed how Alexander ventured into hostile territory that evening, a rival's gala meant to humiliate him. Crystal chandeliers burned above while enemies whispered in shadows. He entered with steel in his gaze, refusing to bow. Laura Bennett followed, her presence poised yet wary, eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Robert Kane mingled easily, his smirk widening as he greeted rivals with hidden promises. The narrator described how the air thickened with deceit, every glass of champagne laced with venomous intent. Alexander raised his voice to the crowd, declaring that no empire built on betrayal would stand. Gasps spread like wildfire, but his words left no room for weakness. The jungle's predators circled closer, and the hunt sharpened under golden lights. The narrator described how the night ended in confrontation behind the gala's velvet curtains. Alexander cornered Robert Kane, his words sharp as he demanded to know where loyalty ended and treachery began. Kane's smirk twisted into mockery, his denial slick as oil. Laura Bennett intervened, her voice trembling as she warned both men that enemies thrived on division. Yet, Alexander's fury burned, his vow echoing that betrayal would be punished without mercy. The narrator revealed how the silence afterward pressed like a knife, and Kane's departing smile promised deeper wounds to come. The jungle's rivalries had stepped into the light, and survival now meant drawing blood before dawn. The Empire's war was no longer hidden. It was alive, merciless, and without retreat. The narrator revealed how dawn broke heavy with unease as Alexander Pierce returned to his office, the storm outside replaced by the storm within. Reports spread across his desk, each document a trail of sabotage. He read them in silence, his face carved from stone, before declaring that no betrayal could remain hidden. Laura Bennett urged him to trust his instincts, yet her own voice betrayed fatigue and fear. Daniel Harper lingered close by, his nervous glances betraying guilt he could not contain. The narrator described how the city skyline looked fractured in the morning haze, reflections on the glass like a hall of ghosts. Alexander's vow cut through the silence, his voice the blade of a man prepared to carve truth from deception. The jungle had grown darker, and its predators had drawn closer. The narrator described how whispers of a spy emerged, hidden deep within Alexander's empire. Evidence pointed to information slipping beyond walls meant to protect it. Alexander spoke of rats in the Foundation, vowing to smoke them out before they brought the empire down. Laura Bennett insisted they tread carefully, for paranoia could devour as swiftly as betrayal. Robert Kane leaned into shadows, his smirk widening as though the chaos pleased him. The narrator revealed how the silence between each word became heavier than the storm outside. Fear painted the faces of those who once stood proud, and every eye carried the weight of suspicion. Alexander pressed his fist to the table, swearing that shadows would not consume his throne. The jungle of deception had tightened into a trap. The narrator revealed how night cloaked the city as Alexander received word of a hidden investor manipulating his downfall. He stood by the window, eyes on the skyline glowing with neon scars, as he whispered that the Empire's enemy no longer stood across the table, but pulled strings from afar. Laura Bennett pressed him for names, her words sharp but cloaked in fear. Robert Kane chuckled, suggesting that the unseen enemy had more power than they imagined. The narrator explained how shadows grew taller across the walls, as Alexander clenched his jaw, declaring that no ghost could control what he built. Outside, lightning fractured the skyline, mirroring the cracks within his empire. The jungle was alive with unseen predators, each step silent, each strike closer. The narrator described how Alexander called a midnight meeting in a secluded chamber, demanding answers. Documents spread like wounds across the table, each page a clue that betrayal was close. He spoke of a spy feeding secrets to the rival empire, his voice thunderous with rage. Laura Bennett begged him not to act in haste, warning that shadows hid truths deeper than surface clues. Daniel Harper stammered, his papers shaking in his hands as though guilt weighed him down. Robert Kane remained silent, his smile twisting in cruel amusement. The narrator told how the room seemed smaller with every heartbeat, its walls pressing closer as suspicion turned suffocating. Alexander slammed his hand on the table, declaring that loyalty would be proven or destroyed before dawn. The narrator revealed how the night ended in revelation as Alexander discovered the first undeniable proof of betrayal. A file buried among reports carried the fingerprints of the spy. His voice rang like thunder as he declared that enemies wore familiar faces. Laura Bennett gasped, her eyes wide with fear, as she realized the net of deceit reached deeper than imagined. Robert Kane smirked, offering no defense, his silence more dangerous than words. Daniel Harper lowered his head, his trembling making silence unbearable. The narrator described how Alexander stood taller than the storm, vowing that no shadow would dictate his empire's fate. The air carried the weight of war, and the jungle of deception prepared to claim its first victim. The narrator revealed how Alexander Pierce carried the weight of sleepless nights as he faced the inner circle again. His voice was low yet edged with fury as he demanded loyalty or exposed betrayal. Laura Bennett tried to steady the storm, reminding him that haste could destroy what little trust remained. Robert Kane leaned back in his chair with an amused smirk, his silence sharpened into provocation. Daniel Harper's trembling hands betrayed his fear, his youth crushed under the gravity of the empire's collapse. The narrator described the room as suffocating, every face a reflection of fractured unity. Alexander slammed his hand on the table, declaring that weakness would be cut away before it devoured the company. The empire's leader had reached a breaking point, and the air cracked with the strain of unraveling bonds. The narrator described how the board fractured further when allies whispered doubts in private. Alexander paced the halls like a lion caged in glass, his reflection fractured in every surface. Laura Bennett followed close, her voice steady, though her eyes revealed fear. She urged him to step back before his rage turned allies into enemies. Yet Alexander's reply thundered with defiance, promising to cleanse the empire even if fire consumed it. The narrator revealed how employees in the shadows whispered of collapse, their loyalty tested by fear and ambition. Robert Kane's smirk lingered like poison, feeding rumors with every subtle glance. In that moment, Alexander became both ruler and prisoner of his empire, his fury a weapon and a chain alike. The breaking point had drawn closer, and silence carried the weight of impending collapse. The narrator revealed how the underdog emerged quietly from shadows, a voice overlooked until the chaos made it sharp. No. Daniel Harper stood trembling before Alexander, his youth mocked by older rivals. Yet his words carried weight as he warned that enemies thrived on division within. Alexander studied him with surprise, for the boy he dismissed had grown bold under fire. Laura Bennett urged him to listen, her eyes flashing with rare hope. Robert Kane chuckled, dismissing Daniel's courage as desperation. Yet the narrator described how the room shifted, power subtly bending as Harper's voice grew steadier. The underdog had begun to rise, and the jungle whispered with the promise of unpredictable turns. Alexander felt both wary and intrigued, sensing that survival demanded he heed the voice of the underestimated. The narrator described how late into the night, Alexander retreated to his private office, weighed down by betrayal and doubt. He poured a glass of whiskey, his reflection splintered in the amber liquid. Laura Bennett entered quietly, urging him to rest before his fury consumed what he still held. His reply was bitter, confessing that trust had become a weapon turned against him. The narrator told how silence stretched, thunder outside echoing his thoughts. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression soft yet shadowed with fear. The Empire's leader was no longer untouchable but cracked, and those cracks glowed under lightning. In that fragile moment, Alexander admitted aloud that the jungle had claimed pieces of his soul already. The breaking point was no longer looming, it was within him. The narrator revealed how the Empire's breaking point erupted in a storm of fury. Alexander summoned his board to confront them in a night drenched in thunder. His voice boomed across the table, vowing that betrayal would be met with fire. Robert Kane smirked, answering with sly words that fanned the flames of division. Laura Bennett's pleas for calm drowned beneath the clash of egos. Daniel Harper stepped forward, his voice steady as he demanded unity or ruin. The narrator described how silence followed, the silence of men and women realizing the jungle had turned on them. Lightning illuminated faces pale with dread, and the Empire's foundations trembled with fracture. Alexander stood taller in the chaos, his vow of survival etched in thunder, yet his soul bled with every word spoken. The narrator revealed how Alexander Pierce summoned his board to a midnight confrontation. The storm outside mirrored the storm within as lightning split the skyline and shadows carved jagged lines across the glass walls. His voice was thunder as he declared that betrayal would end tonight. Laura Bennett's pleas for restraint echoed faintly, but were drowned by the weight of his fury. Robert Kane smirked, his silence daring Alexander to strike first. Daniel Harper, though pale with fear, stood straighter, his words sharp as he demanded truth. The narrator described the boardroom as a battlefield cloaked in steel and glass, every breath heavy with threat. Alexander's vow was clear. The Empire would not fall by shadows, but only through war. The final gambit had begun, and there was no turning back. The narrator explained how the clash of wills exploded as Alexander accused Robert Kane of feeding information to their rival. His words struck like daggers, and silence shattered as Kane laughed, mocking the Empire's fall. Laura Bennett's face paled, torn between horror and disbelief. Daniel Harper stepped forward, his voice trembling yet clear as he backed Alexander's claim with documents of proof. The narrator described the eruption of voices around the table, each board member rising with fear and anger. Betrayal had stepped into the light, and Kane's smirk twisted into venom. Alexander slammed his hand on the table, declaring that loyalty had an unyielding price. The jungle had bared its fangs, and the final battle for control had begun. The narrator described how chaos consumed the chamber as accusations flew like blades. Alexander shouted that Kane's betrayal had poisoned the Empire, but Kane retorted that Alexander's obsession had blinded him. Laura Bennett raised her voice, begging them both to stop before ruin became absolute. Daniel Harper moved between them, his young voice rising above the storm, demanding unity before enemies devoured them all. The narrator explained how the boardroom became an arena of fire and fury, each face illuminated by lightning. Kane's smugness faltered for the first time as Harper laid out undeniable evidence. Alexander's rage burned hotter, his vow rising above the storm. Tonight, either loyalty would prevail, or the Empire would collapse in blood. The narrator revealed how the confrontation reached its peak as secrets tumbled into the open. Kane sneered that Alexander's empire was already owned by a shadow investor who waited to seize control. Gasps spread through the room as the revelation struck like lightning. Laura Bennett clutched the table, her fear plain, whispering that the enemy had been inside the walls all along. Daniel Harper's voice rose, insisting that they still had strength to fight if they stood together. Alexander's fury hardened into grim resolve as he swore that no hidden master would take what he built. The narrator described how the silence that followed felt heavier than thunder, a silence thick with revelation. The jungle had revealed its cruelest truth, and the stakes had risen beyond survival into destiny. The narrator described how the climax exploded with fury as Alexander and Cain faced each other like predators in the final moment before blood. Alexander's vow thundered that betrayal would end with Cain, no matter the cost. Cain's mocking words cut like knives, daring him to strike. Laura Bennett's cry for peace echoed unheard, her desperation lost to the roar of conflict. Daniel Harper stepped forward, his voice steady as he declared that the Empire's survival demanded Alexander's strength and Cain's exile. Lightning split the skyline, illuminating faces pale with dread and rage. The narrator revealed how the boardroom trembled, as though the building itself felt the weight of destiny. The jungle had demanded its cost, and the night ended with the Empire balanced on a knife's edge. The narrator revealed how the storm ended at dawn, leaving silence heavier than thunder. Alexander Pierce stood at the head of the boardroom, his empire fractured beyond recognition. He declared that the company would survive, but at a cost none would forget. Laura Bennett's eyes carried sorrow as she admitted that trust could not be rebuilt overnight. Robert Cain had been expelled, yet his smirk haunted the room like a ghost that refused to fade. Daniel Harper, steady for the first time, promised to rebuild what had been broken. The narrator described how Alexander's voice trembled beneath iron, for victory had come wrapped in ruin. The jungle's war was over, but its scars carved themselves into every face around the table. The narrator explained how Alexander retreated into his office, the Empire's victory hollow in the silence of glass and steel. He poured whiskey with hands that trembled only slightly, whispering that survival had claimed a part of his soul. Laura Bennett entered quietly, her voice soft with sorrow as she confessed that loyalty had nearly destroyed them both. Daniel Harper's name echoed in the air, no longer a shadow but a rising figure who carried the weight of renewal. The narrator described how Alexander's reflection fractured in the whiskey glass, his eyes searching for the man he once was. He whispered that ambition had demanded a price too heavy to bear. The jungle had been conquered, but its survivors stood alone in ashes. The narrator revealed how the board convened one final time, but its energy had shifted. Daniel Harper stood at the forefront, his voice calm and resolute, promising to rebuild with integrity. Alexander Pierce listened in silence, his figure looming like a relic of a fading era. Laura Bennett's expression softened, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. The narrator described how Alexander's silence carried the weight of recognition. The underdog had risen, and the Empire's future no longer rested in his hands. Robert Cain's absence remained heavy, his betrayal a scar that shaped every decision. The jungle had devoured one king and crowned another, but the cost of ambition lingered like smoke. Alexander closed his eyes, hearing the faint echo of his vow to survive, but survival had changed its face. The narrator told how Alexander walked alone through the corridors of his empire, the halls once alive with ambition, now echoing with silence. Employees glanced at him with uncertain respect, their whispers carrying rumors of transition. He passed offices that reflected his figure, fractured across glass, a man both ruler and ghost. Laura Bennett followed at a distance, her eyes filled with sorrow, as though she knew he carried burdens no one else could bear. The narrator described how his footsteps echoed like thunder fading into memory. He whispered that the crown was heavy not because of glory, but because of its cost. The jungle's king had survived, but he no longer ruled. His empire was alive, but his spirit walked in shadows. The narrator revealed how the final moment arrived as Alexander stood before the glass wall of his office, the city sprawling beneath him. Lightning had given way to sunlight, but the silence felt heavier than storms. He whispered that victory had no meaning if it demanded his soul. Laura Bennett entered, yet she spoke no words, for none could soften the truth. Daniel Harper's shadow stretched long in the corridor, his rise inevitable. The narrator described how Alexander pressed his hand against the glass, his reflection staring back like a stranger. In the calm, a haunting silence settled, the kind that followed war, where triumph and loss intertwine. The jungle had chosen its survivor, and Alexander Pierce was left staring into the ashes of ambition.